The rain hammered the earth as the dog dug through the soaked ground, his paws bloody, his body shaking from cold and desperation, until he found a real hand clutching a broken pendant he knew by heart. The soldier was alive, barely breathing, buried by those who swore to protect him, abandoned like a secret meant to stay hidden forever. This is not a story about heroes in uniform. It's a story about loyalty that no lie could break, about a bond forged deeper than blood, about a dog who refused to forget. If this journey stirs something inside you, if you believe some promises are bigger than fear, stay with us. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what moment in this story would have made you stay or run. I can't wait to hear your heart on this. The funeral notice arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, wrapped in the chill of bureaucracy. Clara Johnson, a woman whose every wrinkle spoke of storms weathered and battles fought in silence, held the letter in her trembling hands. The ink, cold and official, declared that her son, Private Marcus Johnson, had died heroically in action overseas. The neighborhood, a tired line of broken brick houses in the heart of Birmingham, gathered in hushed condolences. Yet while casseroles and flowers piled up on her porch, Clara remained still, sitting at the kitchen table where the sunlight used to dance on Marcus's homework papers. Her hands never stopped trembling. It wasn't grief that gripped her, it was doubt. Clara stared at the military-issued portrait of Marcus, a stiff photograph taken months before his deployment. His eyes, those fierce, deep-set brown eyes, refused to settle into the hollowed piece. No, they burned with a message she could not read, as if screaming across time and distance. That night, when the last visitor had left and the world outside fell into uneasy sleep, Clara heard the scratching. Faint at first, a claw against wood. Heart hammering, she followed the sound to the front door. When she opened it, standing in the frame of the yellow porch light, soaked and shivering, was Maximus, Marcus' canine partner. His ribs showed through his matted fur. His eyes were wild, desperate. Clara gasped and knelt immediately, arms wide. Maximus, once a majestic figure trained for war and discipline, whined low in his throat and stumbled into her embrace, burying his head against her chest. Tears blurred Clara's vision as she felt the dog's body shake against her. Soldiers had come to her house days earlier, presented the flag, bowed their heads, offered scripted apologies. Yet here was Marcus' partner, returned from the battlefield alone. Something was terribly wrong. Maximus never left. Marcus wasn't where they said he was. Over the following days, Clara nursed Maximus back to health. She spent hours brushing the burrs and grime from his coat, cleaning his wounds with trembling hands. And every night, Maximus would sit by the front door, rigid, staring into the dark, emitting soft, guttural growls that curdled her blood. Each growl wasn't anger. It was warning. Clara felt it deep in her bones. Something unfinished. Something calling. A week after Maximus' return, Clara sat again at the kitchen table, the yellowed photo of Marcus in her hand. She whispered to it, "If you're still out there, baby, send me a..." At that exact moment, Maximus barked sharply, startling her. He ran to the hallway where Marcus' duffel bag sat unopened since the day the military returned his belongings. The dog clawed at it frantically until Clara, heart hammering, moved to unzip it. Among the standard-issue gear, she found Marcus's favorite hoodie torn, blood-stained, and something else, a small muddy object hidden in the folds. It was Marcus's St. Christopher pendant. Marcus never took it off. Never. Her breath hitched. This wasn't closure. This was a breadcrumb. Clara's suspicion deepened when Maximus refused to let anyone else touch Marcus' things. A delivery man once brushed past the duffel bag, and the dog snarled in a way that made even the bravest soul back away. Neighbors began whispering about Clara's delusions, about how grief made people see signs where there were none. Clara didn't care. She knew what her gut told her, and her gut had never lied. Not about Marcus. One evening, just before the crimson sun dipped behind the cracked roofs of the neighborhood, Clara sat on the porch steps with Maximus beside her. She stared out at the thin line of woods that bordered their block. The trees, skeletal against the dying light, seemed to shift and whisper among themselves. Maximus's ears perked, his body tense, his gaze locked onto the woods. Clara followed his stare. The darkness between the trees seemed to pulse, alive, beckoning. A shiver ran down her spine. Maximus whined, low and urgent. Without thinking, Clara whispered, "Show me." The dog stood, muscles taut, and took a hesitant step toward the edge of the yard. Clara's heart raced. Was she crazy? Chasing shadows born of grief? But grief didn't explain the dog. It didn't explain the pendant or the bloodied hoodie. And it damn sure didn't explain the feeling in her gut that Marcus was not dead. Not yet. Maximus looked back at her, eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath catch. It was the same look Marcus gave her the day he shipped out, a look that said, "Trust me, Mama." Clara rose to her feet, feeling years of heartbreak and hardship weigh heavy on her bones, but also a surge of something else. Steel sharpened by love and forged in the fire of motherhood. She wasn't going to sit here waiting for closure that never came. She would find her son. With Maximus leading the way, she stepped off her porch and into the shadows of the world that had stolen her boy. The woods awaited. So did the truth. The darkness of the woods swallowed Clara Johnson whole as she stepped beyond the last brittle edge of her backyard. Maximus prowling just ahead of her with every muscle rippling under his damp coat. The thick smell of moss and rot wrapped around her senses, but Clara's focus was pinned to the dog's every move, to the sense of urgency vibrating through him like a living wire. The trees stood like silent witnesses as Maximus veered sharply left, heading toward a thicker cluster of oaks, where the canopy above knitted tighter, suffocating the faint moonlight trying to pierce through. Each step she took deeper into the woods felt heavier, as if unseen hands clawed at her ankles, warning her to turn back. But Clara pressed on, feeling the same steely pull that had driven her into these woods to begin with. Her fingers brushed against the fabric of Marcus' hoodie that she had wrapped around herself like a talisman, and the memory of her son's laughter, clear and bright, echoed faintly in her mind, both a comfort and a blade twisting in her chest. Maximus stopped abruptly, his body rigid, his nose pointed directly ahead toward the blackened heart of the woods. He emitted a low, guttural growl that rattled the leaves around them, and Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Following his line of sight, she saw nothing but an impenetrable wall of shadows. As she took a tentative step forward, Maximoff lunged slightly to the side, dragging her toward something half buried under a mass of tangled roots. With trembling hands, Clara knelt down, brushing away the wet leaves and soil. Her fingers closed around something cold and metallic, and as she pulled it free, a gasp tore from her lips. It was a small cross, handmade, the once smooth wood now splintered and rough, the carvings nearly eroded by time and weather. Under the thick crust of mud, she could barely make out the faded initials carved into its surface. M.J. Marcus Johnson. Her breath caught in her throat, her eyes burning with unshed tears. Maximus whined, pressing his head against her shoulder with a desperate insistence that rattled her to the bone. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. This cross had been hidden here, buried deep like a secret shame. As she turned the cross over in her hand, she noticed the deep indentations of teeth marks along one side, clear evidence that Maximus had unearthed it himself, carrying it back to her, refusing to let the memory of Marcus be swallowed by lies. Clara clutched the cross to her chest, her mind racing, her heart a drumbeat of both fear and determination. She staggered to her feet, mud clinging to her jeans, and looked around, feeling the woods close in tighter, as if the very earth wanted to drag her down, silence her discovery. Maximus circled her once, his body tense, his head snapping back toward the same dense thicket beyond them. His message was clear. There was more. Each time Clara's hand brushed against Marcus's uniform jacket draped over her shoulders, Maximus would release a sharp, pained yelp that seemed torn from the very marrow of his being, a cry so raw that it sliced through her like a knife. She couldn't ignore it. She wouldn't. Every fiber of her soul screamed that the jacket, the cross, the woods, all of it were threads woven into a tapestry of betrayal yet to be unraveled. Clara took a faltering step forward, her boots sinking into the soft earth, and Maximus surged ahead, weaving expertly through the brambles and fallen logs as if he had walked this path before, or maybe as if he had been led here by something unseen. The deeper they ventured, the colder the air grew, carrying with it a whispering breeze that brushed against Clara's skin like ghost fingers, stirring the hairs on the back of her neck. A sudden flash of white caught her eye, half hidden beneath a collapsed log. Maximus barked once sharply and began digging frantically, sending clumps of dirt and decayed wood flying in every direction. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, clawing at the earth with bare hands until her fingers brushed against fabric again. This time thicker, stiffer. Together they unearthed a fragment of tattered camouflage cloth, shredded and stained a dark, almost black hue. Clara's stomach twisted as she recognized it. It was military issue, but this piece didn't belong to Marcus. The tags sewn into the lining bore a different name, a name she didn't recognize, one that sent a new wave of dread curling up her spine. Someone else had fallen here, someone they hadn't bothered to tell the families about. Clara rose slowly, staring at the cloth in her hands, piecing together the unimaginable. This patch of earth was a graveyard hidden in plain sight, a place meant to erase inconvenient truth. Maximus growled again, low and furious, pacing in tight, agitated circles. He barked sharply at the trees ahead, his voice ricocheting through the forest like a gunshot. And then he froze, staring into the dark as if he could see something she could not. Clara followed his gaze, her skin prickling with a primal awareness that someone, was watching. The trees loomed taller here, their skeletal branches entwined like twisted fingers overhead, and the path narrowed into a gash in the earth barely wide enough for a person to slip through. Maximus glanced back at her, his body vibrating with urgency. Clara clutched the cross tighter, the jagged edges biting into her palm, anchoring her to the resolve that had carried her this far. Whatever lay beyond that shadowed cleft, she had to face it. Her son's life, or whatever remained of it, depended on it. Clara took a shuddering breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward into the darkness, without a word, Maximus pressing close to her side, their shadows swallowed whole by the waiting woods. The narrow gash in the earth swallowed Clara and Maximus whole, forcing them into single file, their bodies brushing against damp walls of tangled roots and rotted wood as they moved deeper into the unseen belly of the forest. Every few steps, Clara's foot would snag on an unseen root or sink into soft, treacherous ground, but Maximus pressed on with a determination that brooked no hesitation, his powerful shoulders pushing through the claustrophobic tunnel with an urgency that Clara matched breath for breath. The air grew heavier, damp and metallic on her tongue, as if they were descending into the lungs of the earth itself, and Clara found herself gasping, not just from exertion, but from the weight of something unseen pressing down on her chest. Suddenly, the path opened into a small clearing, and Clara stumbled forward, her boots skidding on the loose gravel scattered underfoot. Maximus stopped abruptly, ears pricked, body tense, nose twitching rapidly. It was then that Clara noticed marks gouged into the dirt. Impressions left by boots heavy with mud and age. Prints that should not have been there in a place this forgotten. Clara crouched low, brushing her fingers over the indentations. The old instincts of a mother who had spent her life noticing the smallest of details flaring into sharp focus. These weren't ordinary boots. The tread was wrong, too uniform, too deliberate, and too clean in their pattern to belong to a casual hiker or a lost soldier. Her heart hammered against her ribs as realization sank in. She had seen these patterns before, back when Marcus had shared stories he wasn't supposed to tell, when he had spoken in hushed tones about units that operated in the gray space between legality and treason. These were the boots issued to counter-surveillance teams, soldiers trained not just to fight the enemy but to erase anyone deemed inconvenient, even their own. Maximus sniffed the ground frantically, letting out a low whine that vibrated through Clara's bones. The boot prints circled the clearing, leading in no clear direction, as if whoever left them had been hunting, or worse, setting a trap. The hairs on the back of Clara's neck prickled as she rose slowly to her feet, scanning the twisted forest around her. She wasn't alone out here. She could feel it in her marrow. She fumbled with trembling fingers for the old handheld recorder she carried on instinct, ever since Marcus had deployed the same battered device she had used to record his childhood recitals. His teenage guitar strumming, his whispered promises on nights when fear threatened to swallow them both whole. Clara didn't know why she felt compelled to check it now, but her gut, that stubborn old sentinel, screamed that something waited to be found. Maximus barked once, sharp and jarring, and darted toward a pile of debris in the far corner of the clearing, nosing aside branches and old scraps of canvas. Clara followed quickly, heart in her throat, until she saw it, a blackened lump half buried in the dirt, its edges melted and deformed by intense heat. Her stomach twisted as she knelt and brushed away the remains of a small recorder, almost identical to the one she carried but scorched nearly beyond recognition. With shaking hands, she pried it from the earth, wincing as the corroded casing cracked in her grip. She pressed the play button on instinct, not expecting it to work, but miraculously, after a few seconds of static and a high-pitched whine, a voice emerged from the battered speaker, faint and broken but unmistakably human. "They're clearing them out," the voice whispered, warped and crackling with interference, each word stretched and shredded by whatever fire had tried to erase them. "Anyone knows too much. They don't come home. They don't." The recording cut out into a shriek of static that made Clara flinch and drop the device, her breath catching painfully in her chest. Maximus whined and pressed against her side, sensing the deep fissure splitting her soul wide open. She picked up the recorder again, pressing rewind with frantic fingers, and tried once more. This time, the voice was clearer, though still warped by damage and distance. "You purge the ones who see too much," the voice hissed, so low it barely registered over the background noise. "Don't trust the letters, don't trust the flags. The ones they say are dead. Some are buried, some are still running." The final word fractured into static again, but Clara didn't need to hear the rest. She understood. This was never about a mission gone wrong, never about heroic sacrifice. It was about secrets too dangerous to expose, secrets that someone had gone to brutal lengths to silence. Maximus let out a low, keening sound, almost a sob, and nudged her hand with his nose, demanding action. Clara's fists clenched around the ruined recorder, her nails digging into the scorched plastic. Fury, grief, and terror boiled inside her in a roiling storm, but it was fury that won, cold and clear. She rose to her feet, scanning the clearing one last time, and noticed a faint path leading away from the circle of boot prints, barely more than a scar through the undergrowth. Maximus caught the scent at once, his body snapping into motion as he began to follow it, his steps fast and sure. Clara didn't hesitate. She tucked the broken recorder inside her jacket, adjusted the cross still hanging around her neck, and plunged after him, her legs burning with exertion but her heart harder than iron. Every beat of her heart now sounded like a drum of war. Find him, save him, burn the lies down to ash. The woods thickened around them again, swallowing the faint starlight overhead, until even Maximus' fur seemed to bleed into the shadows, his form a whisper of movement ahead. Clara stumbled after him, blind and unyielding, deeper into the forest where truths were buried like bones, and the past refused to stay dead. Following the narrow path into a darkness that felt almost sentient, as if the woods themselves conspired to hold their secrets tight against her truth. The deeper Clara and Maximus pushed into the heart of the woods, the more the air itself seemed to thicken with secrets and silent screams long since swallowed by moss and dirt. Branches clawed at her jacket, thorns tore shallow scratches into her skin, but Clara pressed on without a sound. Her focus narrowed to the rhythm of Maximus's determined gait, and the burning need inside her to uncover whatever filth had buried her son's truth. They broke through a thicket into a clearing where the remnants of an abandoned operations post stood rotting beneath the crooked skeletons of ancient trees, battered crates stacked beside rusted communications equipment, left to decay in the damp earth. Maximus immediately began sniffing around the perimeter, nose low and movements sharp, while Clara moved cautiously among the debris, her instincts alert to every creak of shifting branches and every gust of fetid wind. In the center of the clearing lay a charred folder, half consumed by fire but miraculously preserving several sheets inside, their edges singed and their ink smudged but still legible under the dim light of her flashlight. Clara's hands trembled as she pried the folder open and tilted it to read. What she found made the blood in her veins turn to ice. Stamped across the top of the document were the words, "Internal Investigation." lay cold. The document detailed a series of allegations brought against Lieutenant Colonel Hartman for racial discrimination and unlawful endangerment of minority soldiers under his command. A list so damning it would have ended any man's career if it had been allowed to surface. Yet scrawled across the final page in a hurried, jagged hand were 3 words: "Case closed." Clara's fingers dug into the damp paper, her knuckles whitening with fury as she realized the betrayal cut even deeper than she had feared. Hartman hadn't just failed her son. He had actively conspired to erase him, to hide whatever truth Marcus had uncovered behind a smokescreen of red tape and forced silence. Maximus barked sharply, drawing Clara's attention to a battered file cabinet that had been knocked onto its side, its drawers partially pried open, and their contents spilling like the entrails of a gutted beast. She rushed over, ignoring the stab of pain in her knees as she dropped to the ground and began sifting through the scattered papers, tossing aside soggy, unreadable scraps until her fingers closed around a laminated roster sheet. The ink faded but intact. Her eyes scanned the list feverishly, her breath catching in her throat as she reached the section labeled KIA confirmed. Name after name blurred past her vision, but nowhere, not once, did she find Marcus Johnson listed among the dead. His name wasn't there. Private Marcus Johnson had no official death recorded by the army. Clara reeled back on her heels, clutching the roster sheet to her chest as if it might somehow stabilize the world tilting violently around her. She felt the bile rise in her throat. The sickening realization that everything, every salute, every folded flag, every tear shed by neighbors who believed the narratives spoon-fed to them, had been based on a lie. Maximus pressed against her side, his body vibrating with tension as if he too sensed the seismic shift in reality that threatened to tear Clara apart. Somewhere deep within the woods, a crow called out, its cry harsh and broken, echoing the raw wound opening inside her. Clara rose unsteadily to her feet, clutching the roster sheet and the scorched folder like weapons, her mind already racing ahead. If Marcus wasn't officially dead, then he was either a prisoner, a fugitive, or something worse. Something too dangerous for the military to admit had ever existed. She had no way of knowing how much time she had to find him, but she knew with a mother's certainty that whatever forces had orchestrated this deception would not sit idly by if they learned she was pulling at the threads of their carefully woven lies. Maximus gave a short, urgent bark and trotted toward a trail Clara hadn't noticed before, a faint scar through the undergrowth marked only by the occasional scuff of boots and broken branches. Clara didn't hesitate. She shoved the documents into her jacket, wiped her muddy hands on her jeans, and followed Maximus down the hidden path, her steps fueled by a righteous fury that no thicket, no soldier, no conspiracy could extinguish. As they moved, Clara pieced together fragments of conversations she had overheard over the years. Stray remarks Marcus had let slip about missions that didn't officially exist, and soldiers who vanished without graves or eulogies. Swallowed by the machinery of silence, she remembered the haunted look in his eyes the last time they spoke face to face, the way he had hugged her a second too long, as if he had already known he was walking into a nightmare he might never escape. The path twisted and turned through the dark, each bend revealing new horrors. Spent shell casings half buried in the mud, shreds of uniforms caught in the underbrush, the acrid smell of old fires lingering in the air. Every step forward drove home the brutal truth. This forest was not merely a place of death, but a tomb for secrets too dangerous to see the light of day. Clara's breath came in harsh gasps as she forced her body to keep moving, her muscles screaming in protest, her mind alight with a single, blinding purpose. Find Marcus, drag him back into the light, tear down the walls built on his silence. Maximus stopped abruptly at the base of a hill, his body stiffening, his ears pinned back against his skull. Clara stumbled to a halt beside him, peering up through the trees at the faint silhouette of a structure perched atop the rise, its jagged edges barely visible against the starless sky. A cold, sour wind gusted down the hill, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay and something darker. To its core, Clara squared her shoulders, tightened her grip on Maximus' leash, and began the climb, each step an act of defiance against the betrayal that had tried to crush her spirit. She didn't know what awaited her at the top, didn't know if she would find answers or more lies, but she knew one thing with unshakable certainty: she would not turn back. The climb up the hill drained the last reserves of Clara's strength, each footstep a battle against the loose stones and tangled roots that sought to drag her down. But Maximus surged ahead, driven by an invisible thread, pulling him forward with unwavering purpose. Clara clenched her teeth against the ache in her legs and the burning in her chest, her eyes locked on the faint silhouette of the structure at the summit, a hulking ruin that seemed more shadow than stone, crouched like a beast waiting to pounce. The moment they reached the crest, Maximus let out a sharp bark and veered away from the crumbling building. his body taut with urgency as he darted toward the edge of the clearing, where an ancient oak stood sentinel over the battered landscape, its gnarled branches twisting against the night sky like skeletal fingers frozen in agony. Clara followed without hesitation, her boots sinking into the damp earth, her heart hammering against her ribs as Maximus skidded to a halt before the massive trunk. The dog circled the tree twice, his nose pressed to the ground before he stopped abruptly and sat back on his haunches, staring up at the bark with an intensity that made Clara's skin crawl. She approached slowly, the beam of her flashlight dancing across the rough surface of the tree until it caught on something that made her breath hitch in her throat. There, carved crudely into the bark with a trembling hand and a blunt blade, were the words, "Mama, don't trust." Clara stumbled back a step, her vision swimming as she reached out a trembling hand to trace the letters, the jagged cuts still raw against the ancient wood. Her knees buckled and she sank to the ground, pressing her forehead against the tree as a sob wrenched free from her chest. This was Marcus. She knew it in her bones, the same way she knew the rhythms of his laughter and the cadence of his footsteps. He had been here, he had fought to leave her a message, even as the world tried to erase him. Maximus whined softly and pawed at the ground near the base of the tree, his claws scraping against the tangled roots that jutted from the earth like ribs from a shallow grave. Clara wiped the tears from her face with the sleeve of her jacket and forced herself upright, following the dog's lead as he dug with frantic determination. The soil was stubborn, clinging to her fingers like blood, but Clara dug with a mother's fury, with a desperation born of loss and love and the unbreakable bond between them. After what felt like an eternity, her fingers struck something hard and metallic hidden beneath the roots. Her heart stuttered as she brushed away the remaining dirt to reveal a small, battered object. A military dog tag, the chain tangled and snapped, the metal scarred by rust and something darker, something that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Clara pried it free and held it up to the flashlight's beam, her breath catching painfully as she read the names stamped into the surface. Jonathan Marcus A. Her fingers tightened around the tag, the cold metal biting into her skin, grounding her in the nightmare that had become her reality. But it wasn't just the name that sent a shiver down her spine. There, running diagonally across the tag, was a deep gouge, a bullet strike, the force of impact so fierce it had nearly sheared the metal in half. This was no artifact of war, no random casualty of battle. This was evidence of an ambush, a betrayal, a silencing. Marcus hadn't fallen in some far-off firefight against a faceless enemy. He had been hunted, marked and executed by those who were supposed to protect him. Maximus pressed against her side, his body trembling, his muzzle stained with dirt and sorrow. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of the discovery threatening to crush her where she knelt. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee this place of death and deceit, but Clara had never been one to flinch from the truth, no matter how much it tore at her soul. She pocketed the dog tag and rose to her feet, swaying slightly as she gathered her resolve. Somewhere out there, buried under layers of lies and silence, her son's true fate waited to be unearthed, and she would not rest until she ripped the veil away with her bare hands if she had to. She turned her gaze back to the ruined building atop the hill, its broken windows gaping like empty eye sockets, the hollow shell of whatever nightmare had played out within its walls. Maximus whined again and nosed at the ground, pawing insistently toward a narrow trail that wound around the base of the oak and disappeared into the deeper darkness beyond. Clara tightened her grip on the flashlight, her fingers brushing over the cross still dangling from her neck, and without a word she followed the dog down the unseen path, her body moving on sheer will alone. Every step away from the tree felt like pulling free from a gravestone, like tearing herself away from the last tether to a son who had cried out to her through blood and dirt and pain. The path narrowed quickly, the woods closing in so tight that the branches scraped against her arms and snagged her jacket. But Clara pressed on, the taste of rust and rain thick in her mouth, her pulse pounding in her ears like a war drum. Maximus stayed close, his body low to the ground, his movements cautious but relentless as he sniffed out a trail only he could sense. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, the night itself seeming to hold its breath as they passed. Clara's mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, each more terrible than the last, but she clung to the sliver of hope that had kept her moving this far. If Marcus had survived long enough to carve that message, If he had hidden that dog tag where only someone who loved him would find it, then maybe, just maybe, he was still fighting, still waiting for someone to come for him. She would be that someone. She would be the sword that cut through the darkness and dragged him back into the light. Ahead, Maximus paused, his ears pricked forward, his body quivering with anticipation as he stared into a dense wall of underbrush that seemed impenetrable to the naked eye. Clara tightened her grip on the flashlight, her breath hitching in her throat as she took a tentative step closer, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and fierce determination. Ready to tear aside whatever barriers still stood between her and the son she refused to mourn, Maximus stood rigid, nose thrust into the thick wall of underbrush as if he sensed the thinning membrane between their shattered world and something deeper, something buried yet still thrumming with unspeakable truths. Clara Johnson tightened her grip on the flashlight, her knuckles whitening as she used her free hand to pull apart the dense tangle of branches, ignoring the way thorns bit into her palms and fingers. She ducked low, pushing through, her boots sinking into the sodden earth as Maximus surged ahead with renewed urgency. The oppressive darkness swallowed them whole for a moment, before spitting them out into another clearing, and Clara froze, breath caught in her throat, at the sight laid bare before her. Shrouded by the skeletal embrace of dying trees, a long-forgotten military camp stretched out in ruin and desolation, its structures collapsing inward like corpses long past their prime, the canvas of tents rotted into tattered shrouds, the skeletal frames of vehicles rusting into the soil they had once dominated. Maximus gave a sharp, urgent bark and bounded toward the nearest tent, his paws kicking up sprays of ash and debris, the summery vibration with an energy that made Clara's heart pound harder against her ribs. She stumbled forward, weaving between the wreckage, her mind racing with fragmented images of what this place had once been. A bustling outpost, alive with the rhythm of duty and secrecy, now reduced to a graveyard of forgotten sins. Near the remnants of a shattered command post, Maximus began to dig furiously at a mound of charred earth, sending clouds of dust and ash swirling into the stale air. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, coughing against the bitterness that stung her throat, and together they unearthed a battered metal case half melted by fire yet stubbornly intact. With shaking hands, Clara pried the lid open and revealed its contents. Stacks of water-damaged documents, their edges curled and blackened, but still legible under the harsh beam of her flashlight. Her breath caught painfully as she sifted through the papers, recognizing field reports, troop movement logs, supply requisitions all stamped with various levels of classification, none meant to see the light of civilian eyes. And then, hidden among the layers of mundane paperwork, she found it. A sealed envelope, heavy with the weight of something final. Scrawled across the front in a hand she did not recognize were the words, "Constitutional, do not file." Her fingers trembled as she tore the envelope open and pulled free a single sheet of paper, its contents so shocking that for a moment she could not process the words staring back at her. At the bottom of a terse, coded memo detailing necessary eliminations for maintenance of operational secrecy, a name had been scrawled in bold ink as the authorized signed signatory. L.T. Cobb, the very man who had delivered Marcus' death notice, the very man who had smiled with hollow sorrow and handed her a folded flag soaked in betrayal. Rage and nausea battled for dominance inside her. As Clara clutched the memo to her chest, the pieces of the puzzle locking into place with horrifying clarity. Maximus nudged her sharply, breaking her paralysis, and barked once toward the skeletal remains of another tent across the clearing. Clara staggered to her feet, gripping the damning paper like a weapon, and followed the dog's lead. Inside the ruins of the second tent, she found a crude table littered with more debris, scorched folders, shattered radios, cracked screens. Her gaze locked onto a crumpled scrap of canvas pinned under the collapsed frame of a cot, the faint outline of something scrawled across it in thick black marker catching her eye. She dropped to her knees, tugging the fabric free, her heart hammering against her ribs as she spread it flat under her flashlight's trembling beam. It was a map, a rough, hastily drawn sketch of the surrounding area, landmarks barely recognizable, but one thing clear as blood on snow, a section marked with a jagged red X, accompanied by a single chilling word: Doug survived. Clara's hands shook as she traced the path leading from their current position to the marked location. the trail winding through thick woods and crossing treacherous terrain, but not impossibly far. Maximus let out a low whine, pacing in tight circles, his every muscle quivering with pent-up urgency. Clara folded the map carefully, tucking it inside her jacket alongside the memo, her mind a storm of questions and half-formed horrors. Marcus had survived something here, something brutal enough that those who orchestrated it had tried to erase even the memory of this place from existence. And if Marcus had dug himself out from what? A mass grave? A collapsed bunker? A shallow tomb intended to smother inconvenient truths? Then he might still be running, might still be fighting for his life against enemies wearing the faces of comrades. Clara rose to her feet, blood roaring in her ears, her vision tunneling down to a single point of furious focus. She wasn't just chasing ghosts anymore. She was chasing a living son through the ruins of betrayal and death, guided only by the faint, desperate footprints he had left behind for her to find. Maximus moved to her side, his body pressed close to her thigh, his gaze locked onto the dark trail leading away from the ruined camp and deeper into the waiting abyss of the forest. Clara tightened her grip on the flashlight, her pulse a relentless drumbeat of fear and defiance, and without a moment's hesitation, she set off after him, each step carrying her farther from the world she once knew and deeper into a nightmare woven from blood, lies, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. The deeper Clara Johnson plunged into the endless tangle of woods with Maximus at her side, the more she realized that survival was no longer just a matter of finding Marcus. It was about outmaneuvering forces that would stop at nothing to bury the truth alongside him. As dawn threatened to break through the dense canopy, bleeding weak light into the forest's decaying heart, Clara made the decision to turn back toward town, needing answers she could only pry loose from people who still bore living memories of the events that had shattered her world. Maximus stayed close as they retraced their path through the labyrinth of death, his body tense and alert, every step a testament to the unseen threats stalking them from the shadows. Hours later, mud-caked and shivering, Clara stumbled back into the outskirts of Birmingham, her mind churning with questions that burned hotter than the blood pounding in her ears. She headed straight for the local police station, the imposing gray building sitting heavy against the skyline like a tombstone carved for justice long since dead. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, cold and sterile, casting every wrinkle on her weary face into sharp relief as she marched up to the duty desk and demanded to speak to anyone who could help. The desk sergeant, a man whose badge gleamed far brighter than the apathetic glaze in his eyes, listened in silence as she laid out the evidence she had found: the secret camp, the forged documents, the bloody dog tag. And when she finished, he simply shook his head slowly, almost. "Ma'am, there's no investigation to open," he said. "Was smooth as oil but twice as slick. Your son's death was confirmed. You're chasing shadows." Clara slammed the battered memo onto the counter, her hands shaking with fury. "Read it," she hissed. "Explain that signature to me." But the sergeant barely glanced at the paper before sliding it back across the desk toward her, his smile brittle and brittle. "The things are bigger than us," he murmured, almost too quietly for her to hear. "You need to let this go before you get yourself hurt." Maximus let out a low growl from his place at Clara's side, the sound vibrating through the sterile air of the lobby. But she placed a steadying hand on his head, her heart sinking under the weight of realization. They weren't going to help her. They weren't allowed to. As Clara turned to leave, defeated but not broken, a young officer brushed past her, a slip of paper pressed prickly into her hand under the guise of a clumsy bump. She slipped it into her pocket without breaking stride, and didn't look at it until she and Maximus were blocks away from the station, concealed by the shadowed mouth of an alley. Unfolding the paper with trembling fingers, she found a single, hastily scrawled message. "It goes up high. Don't trust anyone. They fill us," carling into a fist around the note. Maximus pressed against her leg, sensing the tremors of rage rippling through her, and Clara realized that she was running out of safe places, if such things even existed anymore. She headed home under a sky rapidly darkening into the bruised hues of twilight, every nerve on high alert, the back of her neck prickling with the certainty that unseen eyes watched every step she took. When she reached her small, worn house, she paused at the gate, her instincts screaming caution. Everything looked normal. The sagging porch, the cracked steps, the battered mailbox. But the stillness was wrong, too complete, like a stage set waiting for the final act of a tragedy. Clara pushed open the gate, Maximus glued to her side, and stepped onto the porch. She unlocked the door and entered, the familiar smell of dust and worn wood rushing to meet her, a bittersweet balm against the growing storm inside her. She moved through the house in silence, checking every room, every window, every shadow corner, but found nothing amiss. Yet the unease coiled tighter in her gut, a serpent waiting to strike. That night, sleep eluded her as she sat in the old armchair by the window, Maximus lying at her feet, both of them poised like sentinels against a siege they could not yet see. The hours dragged by, marked only by the slow ticking of the ancient wall clock and the occasional distant howl of a stray dog. Then, just after midnight, the first scent of smoke reached her. Acrid and sharp, it slithered through the cracks under the door, curling its fingers around her throat. Clara shot to her feet, heart hammering as Maximus erupted into furious barking, the deep, frantic sound filling the small house. Flames licked the edges of the living room windows, their hungry glow painting the walls in frantic orange strokes, and smoke poured into the room in thick, choking waves. Someone had set the house ablaze with her still inside. Clara grabbed her jacket, coughing violently, and tried to move toward the back door, but a wall of fire already devoured the hallway, cutting off her escape. Panic clawed at her, but Maximus barked sharply, circling her, nudging her toward the only window not yet swallowed by fire. Clara stumbled after him, her eyes streaming from the smoke, and together they crashed through the flimsy glass, tumbling out onto the porch roof. The heat roared behind them, the house screaming its death throes into the night, but Clara barely registered it, her entire world narrowing to Maximus's guiding form as he leapt from the porch roof to the ground below, turning back to bark frantically at her. Summoning strength she didn't know she had, Clara followed, the impact jarring her bones but mercifully leaving her alive. She scrambled to her feet, dragging herself and Maximus away from the inferno as neighbors began to pour from their homes, faces etched with horror as they watched her sanctuary burn to ash. But Clara didn't stop. She didn't look back because there was no way this massive sea of neighbors could ever be consumed. Maximus stayed pressed against her side, his body a living shield between her and the smoldering ruin that had once been her home, his eyes burning with the same defiant fire that fueled her battered heart. Somewhere out there, Marcus still needed her. Somewhere beyond the smoke and betrayal, beyond the reach of those who would rather see her dead than see the truth unearthed. Her son's story waited to be finished. Pero wiped the soot from her face, squared her shoulders against the rising wind, and without a backward glance, disappeared into the night with Maximus at her heels. The night wrapped around Clara Johnson and Maximus like a living shroud as they fled from the burning skeleton of her home, the acrid smoke still clawing at their throats even as they put mile after mile between themselves and the ruin left behind. Every step deeper into the outskirts of Birmingham felt like shedding a former skin, leaving behind the life Clara had known for one where only instinct and grit could be trusted. Maximus led the way, his powerful frame cutting through the darkness with unwavering purpose, his nose low to the ground, pulling Clara through back roads and alleys she barely recognized even after decades of calling this town home. Clara's body ached with exhaustion, her lungs burned from the smoke, and her heart beat a staccato rhythm of rage and sorrow. But she refused to let either weakness or fear slow her. She had seen too much, lost too much, and now, with everything familiar reduced to ash, only the truth remained worth chasing. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, it was impossible to tell in the suffocating grip of adrenaline, before Maximus slowed, his body stiffening as they approached the edge of an abandoned industrial lot, hemmed in by rusted fences and crumbling asphalt. Clara hesitated only a moment before following him through a gap in the chain link, her boots crunching over broken glass and debris. The skeletal remains of an old textile factory loomed ahead, its roof sagging inward like a collapsed lung, windows gaping and hollow. Maximus moved with sharp, deliberate movements now, weaving between the wreckage as if guided by a beacon only he could sense. Clara stumbled after him, her limbs numb and clumsy but her mind honed to a singular edge. Follow, endure, uncover. Maximus stopped abruptly near a patch of disturbed earth at the far end of the lot, his body vibrating with excitement and urgency. He began to dig with frantic energy, sending clouds of dirt and gravel flying in all directions. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, clawing at the ground with her bare hands, her fingers numb and bleeding but unheeding. Together they unearthed a battered metal box, its surface pitted with rust but still stubbornly intact. Clara pried it open with trembling hands, the hinges groaning in protest, and inside she found a stack of tightly wound film reels, their labels faded but legible under the pale sliver of moonlight breaking through the clouds. Alongside them rested a battered voice recorder, its plastic casing cracked but the record buttons still stark and red like a drop of fresh blood. With hands that barely obeyed her, Clara pulled the reels free and turned them over, reading the faint scrawl inked onto each canister. Camp Record 1, Camp Record 2, Confession. Her breath caught painfully in her chest as she realized what she held. A visual record of whatever nightmare Marcus had been trapped inside. Proof they had tried so hard to obliterate. Maximus nudged the recorder toward her, his gaze burning into her, and Clara understood. She thumbed the playback switch, the machine whirring to reluctant life, static crackling from the small speaker before a voice, strained and raw, filled the empty lot. "My name is Private Marcus Johnson," the voice said, shaky but defiant. Clara pressed her hand over her mouth to muffle the sob that ripped through her as her son's voice, older and rougher but unmistakably his, echoed across the wasteland. "They told me if I signed it would be easier," Marcus continued, breath hitching mid-sentence. "They told me about my mother would never know." A long pause filled with the muffled sounds of a scuffle, then a new voice barking orders, guttural and cruel, urging Marcus to comply. Another scuffle, a muffled grunt, the clatter of a chair overturned, and then Marcus again, his voice breaking but fierce. "I would rather die than betray my mother." The tape ended with a burst of static so violent that Clara dropped the recorder, her body trembling from head to toe as if the words themselves had cracked her foundations wide open. She clutched the device to her chest, tears pouring down her soot-streaked face, her heart a maelstrom of grief and pride so intense it left her gasping. Maximus whined softly, pressing his head against her side, grounding her against the tidal wave of emotion threatening to pull her under. Clara forced herself to breathe, to think, to move. She tucked the reels and recorder back into the box and reburied it beneath a pile of rubble, hiding it from any eyes that might still be searching, and only then did she stagger to her feet, wiped the back of her hand across her mouth, smiled her and Ash two together into a mask of grim determination. Somewhere Marcus's captors still walked free, cloaked in lies and protected by the same machinery that had burned her life to the ground. But she had proof now, real proof, and with it the means to tear their fortress down stone by stone. Maximus circled her once, his body vibrating with tension, and then looked pointedly toward a narrow alley slicing through the remains of the lot, a path leading deeper into the dead heart of the city. Clara tightened her grip on the recorder, feeling the bruises on her palms and the aches in her bones as badges of honor, not defeat. She squared her shoulders against the biting wind and followed Maximus without hesitation into the darkness, her mind already racing ahead, plotting her next move. Marcus was alive when that recording was made. She could feel it. He was somewhere still fighting, still refusing to break, and now she had to move faster than the enemies that hunted her. Every second counted. Every breath could be stolen if she faltered. Clara Johnson, a mother forged in grief and steel, would not falter. The night clung to Clara Johnson and Maximus like a second skin as they wound their way through the desolate streets. The city around them empty and vast, its ruins whispering stories of abandonment and betrayal. Every step Clara took away from the industrial graveyard felt like dragging herself out of a deeper hole, clawing her way towards something that flickered faintly at the edge of her battered mind. Maximus moved ahead, his body taut with a readiness that made Clara's heart ache, for the dog had long since ceased to be just a companion. He was now her tether to the fragments of a future that refused to die. As they crossed a broken overpass, the distant sound of footsteps reached Clara's ears, sharp and deliberate against the cracked concrete, and she immediately flattened herself against the rusted railing, pulling Maximus close. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving carefully, head swiveling from side to side as if expecting danger with every heartbeat. Clara held her breath, watching, weighing options, until the figure stepped into the sickly light of a flickering street lamp. It was a man, young but worn, his skin dark and his uniform tattered beyond regulation, the patches ripped off and the insignia scratched out. His face was lean, his eyes wary, but it was the way he moved, tight, ready, haunted, that told Clara he was not a threat but a survivor. Maximus let out a soft, almost questioning whine, and the man stopped, his gaze locking onto them with startling clarity. He lifted his hands slowly, palms out in a gesture of peace. "You Clara Johnson," he rasped, his voice shredded by exhaustion and smoke. Clara nodded cautiously, feeling every muscle in her body coil like a spring. The man took a slow step closer, glancing over his shoulder before speaking again. "Name's Elijah Brooks. Used to serve with Marcus." "Used to?" she demanded, the fear and hope wrestling viciously inside her. Elijah's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I ran," he said simply, "when it all went sideways, when they started cleaning house. I couldn't stay and be part of it. I couldn't." He broke off, swallowing hard. "Marcus didn't die out there. He fought. Harder than any of us. He found a way out." Clara staggered, the world tilting around her, and she grabbed the railing to steady herself. "Where is he?" she whispered. Elijah shook his head, anguish etching deeper lines into his face. "I don't know exactly. Last I heard he was making his way back, moving at night, hiding during the day. Their hunter, but he's smart, and he's got something they want bad enough to kill for." Clara's heart soared and shattered all at once, the revelation a balm and a blade. Marcus was alive, but the wolves still circled. "Why tell me this?" she asked, her voice raw. Elijah hesitated, then pulled a crumpled envelope from his jacket, thrusting it into her hands. "That he never stopped trying." Clara clutched the envelope to her chest, her hands trembling, her breath ragged. Elijah stepped back into the shadows, his form already blurring into the darkness. "Watch your back, Miss Johnson," he called softly. "They won't stop, not until you're both dead or the truth burns them down." Then he was gone, swallowed by the night, leaving Clara standing alone with the weight of the future trembling in her hands. Maximus pressed close against her leg, a low rumble vibrating through his chest, his eyes never leaving the space where Elijah had disappeared. Clara tore open the envelope, her fingers fumbling with urgency, and inside she found a scrap of paper stained and battered, the handwriting jagged and desperate. "Mama, I'm closer than ever. Don't stop. Trust Maximus. I love you. Marcus." Tears spilled freely down Clara's cheeks, cutting clean paths through the grime and soot, and she folded the note against her heart as if by holding it there she could draw Marcus back to her side by sheer force of will. Maximus whined and bumped her knee with his muzzle, snapping her out of her reverie, and she realized with a jolt that she had no time to waste. The enemy wouldn't wait, wouldn't falter, and every second Marcus spent running was another second closer to being cornered. Clara tucked the note securely inside her jacket, adjusted the battered cross still hanging around her neck, and with renewed determination, set off once more into the shifting night, her shoulders straighter, her heart burning with a ferocity that no betrayal, no fire, no darkness could extinguish. She didn't know where the next step would lead, didn't know how close or how far Marcus truly was, but she knew one unbreakable truth: she would find him, or she would die trying. Maximus bounded ahead, his form cutting through the darkness like a blade, and Clara followed without hesitation, her silhouette a moving scar against the broken landscape, her soul a beacon screaming into the night that a mother's love would not be denied. The night thickened around Clara Johnson as she followed Maximus through the ragged edge of the forest, her body running on a reserve of strength carved from nothing but love and stubborn hope. The scrap of Marcus's note burned against her chest, a living brand anchoring her to the path, to the belief that somehow, against every possible cruelty, her son still breathed. The storm had begun to gather overhead. Roiling clouds bruised purple and black, the wind clawing at the branches with desperate fingers as if the very world was trying to tear itself apart. Maximus surged ahead, his body straining against the leash of restraint, his nose lifted high as if catching the faintest thread of scent that no human could ever detect. Clara stumbled after him, her boots sinking into the mud with every step, the first drops of rain slicing cold against her skin. But she never hesitated, never wavered, her entire being tuned to the silent cry that pulled her forward. Thunder rumbled low in the distance, a savage growl that rattled the trees to their roots, and the wind howled through the canopy like a wounded beast. Maximus barked once, sharp and frantic, and Clara's heart lurched in terror and anticipation. She broke into a desperate run, her legs screaming in protest, and burst into a small clearing lit only by the intermittent flashes of lightning that split the sky apart. There, in the center of the clearing, a figure lay crumpled on the ground, barely more than a shadow against the wet earth. His body curled protectively around something clutched in his fist. Clara's breath seized in her lungs as she stumbled forward, falling to her knees beside the figure, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she reached out. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene for a single, searing instant, and she saw it. Marcus, or what remained of him, skin stretched tight over bones, clothes in tatters, his face gaunt and hollowed by suffering but unmistakably, irrevocably her son. His fingers were clenched around a familiar object, the battered St. Christopher pendant she had given him before he shipped out, now stained with blood and rain but still glinting defiantly under the storm's rage. Clara choked on a sob as she touched his shoulder, and at her touch Marcus flinched violently. His body coiled with terror before recognition softened his expression into something raw and broken. "Mama," he croaked, the word torn from a throat ravaged by thirst and despair, and he lurched into her arms with a cry that split the storm itself. Clara crushed him against her chest, heedless of the mud and blood and rain, her hands frantic as they mapped the brutal geography of his suffering, counting every rib, every scar, every breath as a miracle. Maximus whined and pressed against them, his body trembling with a mixture of relief and exhaustion, his nose nuzzling Marcus's side as if to convince himself that the boy he had never stopped searching for was truly here, truly alive. Marcus sobbed against her, great racking gasps that shook them both, his fingers knotting into the fabric of her jacket, as if letting go would mean losing himself to the darkness once more. Clara rocked him gently, her own tears mingling with the rain, whispering words of comfort she could barely form, words stitched from love and survival and the indomitable will that had carried them both to this impossible moment. Thunder cracked overhead and the heavens opened fully, drenching them in a torrential downpour. But neither Clara nor Marcus moved, locked together in a reunion forged through fire and betrayal and the unbreakable bond of blood. Minutes or hours might have passed. Time had no meaning in that clearing where miracles were paid for in blood, but eventually, Marcus pulled back just enough to look into his mother's face, his own streaked with mud and salt and something brighter, something fierce. "They tried to break me," he whispered hoarsely, his voice raw but resolute. "They tried to make me forget you, forget who I was." Clara cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs brushing the stubble that had grown wild over his hollowed cheeks. "You didn't," she said, fierce and proud and unyielding. "You never could." Maximus barked once, a sharp, joyful sound that seemed to split the storm's anger, and Clara laughed through her tears, the sound wild and broken and beautiful. Together they rose slowly to their feet, Max leaning heavily on Clara, his spread found. The storm raged around them, but within the fragile circle they had formed, there was only warmth, only defiance, only life reclaimed from the jaws of death. Clara knew the road ahead would be long and brutal, that the forces which had tried to erase her son would not give up so easily. But she also knew something deeper, something truer. They were not alone anymore. They had survived together. She tightened her arm around Marcus, feeling the steady, stubborn beat of his heart against her side, and with Maximus leading the way, they began the slow, painful journey home, step by defiant step, under a sky that wept for all they had lost and all they had found again. If this story touched you even a fraction as deeply as it touched me while writing it, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Every share, every comment helps keep these stories alive. What was the moment that hit you the hardest? And where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. I would love to hear your thoughts and your journey. Your voice matters here.